with some real rock stars here. And it's an honor just to be with all of you as we explore like the critical aspects of working with survivors and amplifying their voices and doing that in a way that's safe, ethical, and empowering. You know, throughout today's discussion, we're going to emphasize a survivor-centered approach, always ensuring that those who choose to share their experiences, they do it with dignity, they do it with autonomy and support. So we're also going to recognize that support doesn't end when the conversation does, right? It doesn't end when we leave this room. Long-term support and follow-up are absolutely fundamental to ensuring that survivors are not left navigating their journey alone. So with these guiding principles in mind, I invite you to engage in today's discussion with openness, empathy, and a commitment to making a meaningful difference. Again, thank you all for being here. Let's get the conversation going. Great panel, like I said, they're rock stars, and we're privileged to have them with us. So first, I'm privileged to introduce Dr. Laura Cinco, who kindly said I can call you Laura.
Yes.
Thank you. And Laura's going to start our conversation in a minute. She's going to provide valuable insights into the survivor-centered approach and how it can shape our work. Dr. Cinco is an like Laura. I'll say Dr. Cinco for that. One more time. Dr. Cinco is an assistant professor at Temple University and the director of research and evaluation at Our Wave, which is an online healing platform for survivors of gender-based harm. And then we have Kyle Linton with us, who's executive director and co-founder of Our Wave. And I skipped over Caroline because I'm out of order. Caroline Starostik is a survivor, advocate, and philanthropist who uses her platform to end all forms of domestic violence and abuse. And back in order, we have Hannah Stender, who's the board chair at Speak Your Truth. She's a dedicated advocate and change maker in the gender-based violence space. And I just want to tell you, 23 years a week from this Friday, she's going to celebrate her freedom anniversary. So that's a big deal. And Amrita Dasgupta, how am I doing? Yeah, okay. Is the executive director of Swayam, a feminist organization based in India that's been working for the last 30 years to address gender inequality and violence against women and girls. So with that said, what a wonderful panel. I'm going to hand it over to you, Laura.
Alrighty. Okay.
Oh, but you know what, Laura? I did want to say something. Oh my God, just redo it. You can stand there. Let me take that. All right, let me tee you up. Okay. Your research really provides insightful commentary on the recovery process for individuals who've experienced gender-based violence. And I love, and we all love, how you acknowledge that the concept of recovery can be really different and unique from one person to another. So I want to tee you up before you do your presentation. Thank you.
Can we move because the screen was over the whatever works. I like to talk in my head, so I'm going to stand there and point to things. But yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me. Today, I'm going to talk about how we might better personalize survivor recovery and really thinking about what are the different ways that survivors might heal and how can we not apply a one-size-fits-all model. So this is really the final product of a culmination of many studies across at least 12 different countries. And this is our final product for that. So I won't talk a lot about the science, but I'll give you a little bit of a background on how we got here. So to start, we really just wanted to better understand what healing states might be. So we know that depending on where you are in your journey, you might have different needs. And we don't have really great personalized ways that we can address survivors' needs based on where they are. So we really want to try to uncover that and help categorize where folks might be to make it easier on providers to be able to provide appropriate care. So we had three main project objectives. So the first one is we want to understand what are those healing states? How might people enter our spaces and what should we know about them? Then I'm a researcher. How do we evaluate it? How can we help make it easier on providers to be able to classify folks, not to put them in more boxes, but just to be able to give us some clues on what might be useful for them in those periods. And also importantly, we want survivors to be able to evaluate themselves. If they want to figure out how they might change over time, what are their perspectives of their healing? So really having both the provider and the survivor approach can help us get a really comprehensive idea of where they are. So I'll talk a little bit about my research approach because to the point of everything being survivor-centered, I really want to show how we got to where we did. So survivors went through an interview. We interviewed survivors in the US, Japan, Ireland, Turkey, and Greece, and we have a lot more studies ongoing now, but the data we have at this moment are from those countries. And all the survivors went through the same exact interview process. So survivors started by doing a social network. So placing themselves in the center of a blank page and mapping out people that they interact with, people who support them, and maybe even people that cause conflict in their life. They then go into a body map. So we had a very blank body, front and back. And we asked survivors to think about how does it feel to be in your body, physically, emotionally, spiritually. And people use words, pictures, all different ways to approach this body map. And I won't get into the culture of it, but it's very interesting. There's a lot of cultural nuances with how people approach that, which is really interesting. We then had a lifeline. So really mapping things across time, highs and lows that folks experienced that were resonating with them at that moment, knowing that your lifeline that you do today might look very different than what you do in a couple of weeks, depending on what's standing out to you. And then we do a card sort. So we focus on a most recent low point, a challenge you're going through, and we get all of these cards, feelings and symptoms, and people sorting through the cards to see what feelings are I may feeling right this moment and what is not relevant to me. And we took all those feeling cards and we helped cluster them together, thinking about how do these things fit to really understand these general themes or what are the struggles that folks are going through, building this recovery action plan. So once I can sort of see what I'm struggling with, what might I need going forward? So we took the data from all 4 of those activities, and the questions we're asking is healing, right? What are some of the things that you did to pull yourself out from those low points? What are some of the things that you want to do in the future? And so once we did all of that, we were able to articulate that survivors approach these activities differently based on where they are in their journey. So we identified 7 potential states a survivor might be in, and I'll go into more detail about them, but we have survivors that might fall into more of a normalizing state, a minimizing state, a state where they're feeling really shut down, a state where they might be feeling very consumed, when they're just surviving, seeking to find some information and support, and then finally feeling integrated. And it's important to note that there is no final destination. This is not linear. People can oscillate between these things over time. So it's really just a way to see where you are now, knowing that might change. So we'll talk about each of these states, and I encourage you to think about survivors that you know, survivors that you love, you've worked with, maybe your own journey. And a lot of people have reflected back. We've showed this to survivors, and they can sort of think about when they may have been in some of those states and to compare to where they are now. So the first state that we found is normalizing. So I didn't recognize even what I experienced was violence. So these folks actually wouldn't really be in our study. If we're saying that you're a survivor, come talk to us, they wouldn't. But in their lifeline, they referred to times where I didn't even know what happened to me wasn't normal and was not okay. So they have these internalized beliefs that might normalize the violence they're experiencing and recognize that they're not really feeling like a survivor in that moment. The next is really minimizing. So again, not linear, but another category we found. So folks that maybe experienced something, it didn't feel right, maybe it felt like a bad date, or it just felt uncomfortable. And they might downplay it as it's not that bad, while recognizing that maybe something just doesn't feel right, but I don't know if it's abuse. I just think it was not, that guy's just a jerk, right? And so I think it's important to really note here, these are very protective mechanisms, right? So there's no sort of blaming or saying you're not far along enough. Like there's a really good reason why people are in these states when they are, and it might not be safe to really name this yet for yourself. Next is shut down. So these are the folks that might just feel nothing, really overwhelmed by symptoms, or just feeling really numb or disconnected from their bodies. So they might recognize that trauma had an impact, but again, protectiveness, they're cutting themselves off from their feelings, their body, just so that they can manage day-to-day experiences. But it can be really tricky to seek help in these spaces because it's just really an overwhelming feeling. We then have folks who are feeling consumed. This is often when a survivor might label, I have experienced trauma and abuse, and it's not right, and the world's not fair. And sometimes all you can think about is that trauma, and it becomes your big identity in that moment or in that time of your life. So it could be really defining of yourself and your decisions. And we often see our best advocates, our loudest voices really speaking out against these issues. So the thing with these folks is they're often functioning pretty well. They're doing all the things, but what we found is it can be hard to be sustainable when that's really always what you're doing and thinking about. It's just really tricky. And so they might not be able to focus on things outside of their survivorship in the way they would like. Then we have the surviving folks. So this might be, there's just so much going on in my own life. I have kids, I gotta get food on the table, my lease is running out, and I gotta figure out my landlord's doing all these things, right? So for these people, there's so much external things going on. We don't really talk about healing in the way that takes so much effort and energy. It's not, we know healing gets better with time, but like it takes a lot of energy for survivors to figure out what works for me, where are these resources. So in this, there's just no time. And there's other things that are more pressing. And so for this group, when I'm thinking about basic needs and helping them with that could be the first step, safety and security, right? That sort of base. Next is seeking. So these are the folks who are often like, all right, I'm ready. I'm going to look at that resource list. I'm going to walk into that clinic. I'm going to go on that website and I'm going to start trying things. And I have to talk to survivors when, my clinical work, I'm a sexual assault nurse and a mental health nurse. And, it's like you're being your own scientist. What's working for me? What's not working for me? But there can be a lot of distress and setbacks because you might walk into the therapy place and it's not the right fit. And so it takes a lot of persistence and perseverance in this space. And then finally, integration. So the one thing we do know is a lot of survivors are striving for this one. They're striving to feel like the survivor is maybe a really important part of who I am, but it's not all of who I am. There's so much more to me and what makes me me. And I have the sense of balance, but setbacks will occur. Healing is not an outcome, it's a lifelong journey. And so you might have setbacks, but I have tools and I can manage them. It doesn't make me a bad person, doesn't make me a bad survivor. It just means I'm having a hard time. And so really having that balance and that gentleness with themselves seems to be what survivors are really looking for in that process. So I have a QR code here, something else I wanted to share. So this first thing here is what providers or researchers can use to evaluate narratives and see where might I place someone if I'm looking at their narrative. And you always want to make sure with caution, you're getting their holistic story. You really want to make sure you have enough of their story to be able to make these judgments. The next one is the self-assessment for trauma recovery, just the survivor self-report, 7 items, very quick. And it can help place people in their own journey. At the gender-based violence scale. I didn't get into this one today, but we talked about the states today, but also there's these like healing outcomes, right? These components of healing, like reconnecting with yourself, connecting with others, kind of like those goals. And so with that, we found through similar studies, we also did like an outcome measure that if you're doing therapy or things, you can track survivor progress over time. And there's a couple articles on that, but this QR code has just the physical instruments. If you want the nerdy research, please email me. I'm happy to send it to you, but I figured let's give them the scales and not give them the paywall articles. And then also integrating these tools into different places. So I'm a part of our wave. One thing we really want to do is increase the accessibility of healing resources in the online space and really kind of give survivors the advanced technology that they deserve and really need that we see in all these other spaces, right? So what we're trying to do at our wave is to integrate these assessment tools into our online platform. So if we're building curriculums or support groups or any sort of interventions we're putting in an online way, we can track how they're actually impacting survivors and see, do they help people shift to states that they want to be in? do they help them move a little bit the needle in terms of healing outcome, if we can call it an outcome, right? This healing journey. And so I just want to highlight our way a little bit while I'm here, a quick plug for us, because I think we are a new organization, not so new in terms of like, I guess the world, but we've been here 5 years. We're new in terms of the space. And we have this really amazing growing community. Right now, survivors can share stories, they can ask experts anonymous questions, and we post those answers publicly so survivors can learn from each other. And we're always building new features and functionalities to help it feel like a vibrant online community where survivors can have the depth of exploring their own healing and also the breadth of learning about the healing from others and having a lot of tools and resources at their fingertips. So here's a little bit of our metrics from our impact report. You go to our website, you can see more of that. But just to say, I think there's so much innovation that can be done in the healing space, and I think survivors really deserve that. And that's all I got. So I really oh, that was really, really valuable. That's all we got. Yeah. I'm gonna jump over to Kyle and welcome Kyle. Our Wave Survivor sharing story platform offers a welcoming and secure environment, and it's a place where survivors can share, right? And they can talk about their experiences at any stage, and it provides such access to valuable resources and support. So talk to us about that. What motivated you and your team to create that platform?
Yeah, so we started in 2018, 2019. Unfortunately, like I think a lot of partners and other folks in this space, after somebody in my life experienced sexual violence. And really, I wanted to, I sort of had this initial idea of, well, I'm helping this person through what they're experiencing, and how can we, coming from a background in technology, like how can we do that at scale? Like how can we really think about these problems and find creative ways to impact a lot more people? And so I came to Brendan on the team, who's an amazing technologist, and I said, hey, I've got this idea. What if we create this space? What if we give people this ability to anonymously disclose in a very, custom social media platform is in essence what we created. And then really what happened is over time, we grew in all these different ways. We started allowing survivors to ask us questions. We started to allow survivors to tag their stories with very specific pieces of data so that we can understand these broader patterns. And by sort of giving survivors the ability to share in their own words, we started to see these really amazing things happen where, you might have a survivor that shares something, but then you'd have like 10,000 people who use the same words and the same language and the same ideas would find that content and then would start the process of healing. And really, I think what we're most excited about long-term is if we're looking at sort of the process of recovery for survivors after experiencing violence, different things work for different people. A lot of people access in-person services, which are amazing and helpful. It gives them legal reporting options. It gives them, in-person, support groups. But we really have this dream with sort of the ability to use technology to how do we scale that? How do we scale that to populations across the world in different languages? How do we scale that in a data-driven way, incorporating really amazing research that Laura's doing and other researchers to say, well, what if we could take that really unclear and messy process of healing, where we say healing is not linear. What if we could create these pathways and make it a little bit more clear for survivors, where if we knew certain things about their background and knew what sort of state they were in, we could then give them better resources that were more customized to them. So that's really, I think, the dream, and we're sort of actively, moving on it every day, is just trying to untangle that web and say, how do we do this in a more data-driven, but then using the power of technology, scalable way? How do we build online support groups and healing curriculums and track data to then share for prevention efforts? So there's just huge opportunities with sort of the technology we created and the various partners we have, including No More and Me Too and others, to do this work all together.
That's fabulous. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And then Carolyn, you wasted no time jumping in. In partnership with the team at No More, you created the Lighthouse, the Survivor's Guide.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's a comprehensive resource designed to empower survivors of domestic violence. Yeah, and with the knowledge and support that they need to navigate their journey. So it provides practical tools and tips and guidance and so much to help them with next steps. So Yeah, talk about the origins of the guide and the wide review and the vision for it.
Well, the lighthouse was created as an instrument to my own healing. So I envision an approach, like an informal conversation between two girlfriends or two sisters or two cousins. It's a resource you can always count on for information, for knowledge, for support. I always tell people, the lighthouse from now on is your absolute bestie, girlies, because you can always count on it. Whether you are in a very dangerous, chaotic, violent relationship or not, when you can recognize the very first signs of abuse, you can save a life. And I think the earlier you recognize those signs, the earlier you can detect those red flags, the safer it is to get out.
It's a lifeline.
It's a life.
So what role do you think a resource like that does to empower? Well, talk about that.
I think it's the role of a best friend, a built-in best friend. Or, you know, an older sister, somebody you can go to. In this case, it's not somebody, it's a resource guy, but it's a place you can go to for acquiring knowledge and for information, for support, for resources.
Thank you for putting yourself out there.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Thank you. Hannah,
Yeah.
Speak Your Truth Today, right, facilitates one of the largest online support groups with over 19,000 survivors walking alongside them at every stage of their healing journey. Pretty impressive stuff. And this is a survivor-led group, offers peer-to-peer support, moderated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, yeah, to ensure a safe and supportive space. And your group welcomes survivors, including those still in abusive relationships.
Yes.
Yeah, breaking down the barriers. So Speak Your Truth provides such a unique space for survivors to connect, share stories, and uplift one another. And so in what ways does the group offer essential support to individuals in rural areas? So we haven't talked about the vulnerable populations, people with mobility challenges who have limited access to in-person resources.
Sure. So the great thing about Speak Your Truth Today is that it is strictly a social media support group. Therefore, anybody with a social media account can apply to be part of our support group. You do not need to physically access any sort of local resources, which in rural communities are not only few and far between, but very difficult to get to, maybe dangerous for an individual to get to. We have situations where most local organizations require survivors to have left their abusive relationships prior to joining due to safety concerns, which is totally respectable, makes complete sense. That said, this gives you a chance to take our quiz to see if you are in an abusive relationship. It gives you a chance to reach out when you're feeling you're most isolated and most alone in situations where you cannot always access other human beings. Those around you are not those people that you can turn to and trust. This platform gives you that option.
Just love hearing about the resources. They're just so valuable. Can you help us understand how you bridge the gap for those in need of assistance?
Sure. So basically, we end up taking those who are losing the ability to access locals and moving them to the social media platform allows them to have a safe space to discuss and access things. We also have about 42% of our users have disclosed that they are disabled to some extent. And that about 67% have disclosed that they're mid to low income. So that gives us a chance to access people who may not have the abilities to do resources.
Really impressive and alarming. It just,
The great thing is that our moderators are all trauma trained advocates, and every single post that is posted is previewed prior to being posted. So if there's any red flags in there for any reason, for their safety, for the chance of patrol, for whatever it may be, it is all looked at prior And then that moderator can have a conversation with that user anonymously, privately, and then they can go out.
It's fabulous. Thank you. And Rita, gosh, we want to hear from you. So SWAYAM is a feminist organization in India, founded in 1995, focused on ending violence against women and promoting gender justice. We provide support services for survivors of domestic and gender-based violence, including counseling and legal aid, vocational training. Like the list goes on and on. Shelter assistance, empowering women to rebuild their lives with dignity. And SWAYAM also engages in community outreach, education, advocacy to really challenge those patriarchal norms, right? And promote change through awareness campaigns and policies. And so my understanding is a key focus is helping survivors amplify their voice and shape solutions and influencing policy and contributing to the shifting public attitudes, legal protection. Yeah. So how does SWAYAM ensure that survivors feel safe, feel heard, and feel empowered when sharing their experience?
Thank you so much. I think it's such a privilege hearing everybody speak because there's so many new ideas are taking away and new phone numbers taking away. And I think what's unique is the world is getting smaller, and I think technology is bringing the world closer, and I think there's always something new to learn from each other. And I think platforms like these and spaces like this is very important for us to build bridges and kind of learn about good practices from each other. So as Carol talked about SWAYAM, what we've been doing is on one hand working with survivors of violence for 30 years now. And on an average, we work with what we call new cases, new women who come to us, between 800 and 1,000 women a year. And we have old cases, so there is no closed service, so people can come to us as and when. So on average, there's about another 1,000 women from earlier years who are still engaging with us. Obviously, as is very evident from this conversation here, that mental health and self-care is very, very important. Anybody who has been through violence of any kind has some level of trauma. It doesn't have to be mental health related, it is trauma related. And I think what is unique about SWAYAM, and it's thanks to Anuradha who started SWAYAM, is integrating mental health services with casework services, which is very unique, not just in India, but I've worked in the UK. It wasn't there then, because usually you refer out to your GP or to a doctor for counseling services. To have those services indoor makes a huge difference. So over the last 30 years, our services have kind of grown with the needs of the survivors. So it started off as counseling only, but also as we know that survivors do experience isolation and this constant belief and denial and everything you talked about, all of you talked about. So a lot of group work was integrated into our space. And I mean, currently, a lot of the group work is based on what the survivors require. So in India, again, based on the need, we are doing group works around parenting because a lot of single moms don't know how to manage their children. We do something called intergenerational workshops, looking at how do you bridge the gap between a new generation and kids and mothers. We do anger management. A lot of these women are very angry and they don't know how to express themselves safely. We do assertiveness workshops, and these are all designed with our mental health consultants and our mental health professionals based on what the women require at that point. So all of these services are integrated along with the one-to-one counseling services. I won't go into details about what we do with the children, which is another huge element of the work we do. But I think it's quite obvious that post-COVID things have become a lot more complicated. And I think globally, mental health is being recognized as a kind of people in crisis, and it's not just survivors, it could be any one of us. And I think all the more important that we put our resources together. And what's interesting about the services that you're providing is looking at more accessible, possibly free and anonymous services, which is not easily available because counseling, one-to-one counseling is a very expensive model of approach. What we've also done recently, I just wanted to share this as a good practice, is we work in communities, so in villages and urban spaces with groups of women and groups of men. And over the years, when you empower them, they become more sensitive, they can understand cycles of violence, and they're able to identify with challenges that patriarchy puts on them or that violence has made them kind of experience. And they all now want counseling. but we cannot give counseling to, thousands of people in a village. So we've kind of created with our mental health teams a program called Barefoot Counselors. So basically identifying community women who are empowered, articulate, smart, and wanting to volunteer, and training them to be these barefoot counselors, giving them, they're like first aiders in the village, who would identify those basic issues, referring them to the local hospitals, giving initial support. So, I mean, these are all stopgap measures that is required because there is no one, as all of you were talking about, there is no one model that fits the whole world. The other unique thing I want to talk about is there was always a belief that we don't use the word victims. We use, I mean, again, everybody uses different words. We use the word survivor, but we also take a woman from being a victim to survivor to agents of change, because there's a constant belief that there's something you can give back. You've been a survivor and you've recovered and you have some inherent potential to give back to the larger space and community, because Swayam's work is two-pronged. So one is survivors, we are working with survivors, and the other is preventing violence from happening. Or else we would continue providing survivor-centric work and we are not challenging the larger society, whether at the individual or societal or institutional level. So that's our prevention work. So we have something called a music group, a theatre group, a dance group, and a quarterly magazine. These are all run and done by the women. When I talk about music or it is songs or theatre that they write on dowry or child marriage or domestic violence. What we provide is a mentor or a trainer. And then they are trained to then go and perform these in street performances during awareness programs. So it's a lot more interesting than me talking and having a group of survivors do a play on domestic violence and engage. They themselves feel empowered because they are now agents of change in a space, encouraging people that, you're not alone. If we can do it, so can you. So that model is really working. And we've just added a new element in 2018. It's called Nadi Adhikar Pratishta Manch, which basically means women's rights kind of a platform where women become caseworkers. So survivors, we train them to be caseworkers. They know patterns of violence, they know counseling, they know self-care, they know all the laws, they know where to go, how to talk to the police, how to go to court. So we are there as a back-end support, supporting them. And there are several of them who are now becoming grassroots activists in their own village or in their own area, because you cannot have the NGOs or the civil society organizations can't grow in the numbers that we require them to grow. Funding is limited. So this is a sustainable model that we've created so that we can't grow, but we can grow women and their skills and empower them to reach out to other women. So more women can kind of get support and advice. So yeah, very briefly, I can keep talking.
You're very busy.
Yeah.
You're very busy. Just tell me real quick, what role does community engagement play?
Huge, because somewhere if you don't work with the larger community, so if you give support, because we are a direct frontline service, if you're working with the woman and she goes back to the largest society, and society means the family, society means the police, the courts, the institutions. So we are then working at different levels. It's not easy. Some doors open and some doors close all the time. So, if the door with the lawyers open, the doors with the police close. It's a constant battle, but I think it's an ongoing thing that we all have to engage at the community level. And also, I was mentioning earlier, we work in smaller groups of communities, as we call, this is our specific area, Lower East Side, for example, and we work with groups there and we create women's groups and men's group. And the ultimate aim is to empower them to be change makers in their own space. So when Swayam exits that space, there'll be role models who will be able to advocate for survivors and rights in that space. And that model did work during COVID because we were stuck at home. It was these change makers in those communities who were doing relief work and crisis work and engaging with survivors. So I think ultimately we have to engage our communities a lot more, because organizations like ours, we have limited reach and we can't keep expanding. We can't keep getting funds to become bigger and bigger, because even if we get big, we won't cover everybody.
I said at the beginning, these folks are rock stars, clearly rock stars. And so thank you for sharing. I just want to kind of pivot to some individual questions. And I think we've got time to ask the audience if you all have questions. Caroline, I'm going to start with you. Okay.
Yes.
So if you could offer just one key piece of advice to a survivor struggling with whether or not to speak out, what would it be? Do it. Do it.
Yes.
Just do it. I feel like Nike commercial.
Yes,
Yeah.
if you keep quiet, you're protecting your abuser. And you don't want to do that. They need to be held accountable. So speak loudly, make your story heard, make your truth heard. And it's a very rewarding journey. And yeah.
Thank you. Great answer. Great, Hannah. How about you? If you could offer one key piece of advice to survivors struggling with whether or not to speak out.
Well, the first thing I would say is that it's a very personalized choice to speak out or not. For safety, for your own journey, for what works for you in your own safe space. For me personally, I started speaking out. My first speak out was 1 week after I put my abuser in jail. I spoke out to about 200 people doing a candlelight vigil during Sexual Violence Awareness Month. And that was it. I have not looked back since. I have been speaking out for 23 years. I have shared my story on every platform I can find, and I will continue to do so because for me, it empowers me to take what happened to me and make sure that I am trying everything I possibly can to make sure it doesn't happen to somebody else. That somebody else hears my story and says, hey, that's where I'm at right now. How can I get help? Where can I find resources? Not, oh, I'm going through this alone. And so personally, that is my story. That said, Speak Your Truth Today also works very hard on helping survivors find that inner voice again. That is one of the key pieces that is lost in many individuals dealing with abuse, is that identity, that sense of self, that ability to trust your gut and understand that your instincts are not always going to lead you into these situations. And to be able to do that is where Speak Your Truth Today comes in and tries to allow survivors to hear other people telling their stories and trusting their gut, so that way they can go ahead and do this.
Thank you, Hannah. Kyle, how about you? One piece of advice, words of wisdom to survivors that are struggling whether to talk out loud.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that we hear more than anything else is just the survivors, share something of all different backgrounds and identities, and they say, I felt like I was alone experiencing this, right? And so I think that all of us in different ways support survivors directly in letting survivors not feel so alone, like letting them know that their concerns and their ideas and what they thought might have been wrong, something that happened, whether it was recent or sometimes we get stories from folks that are 40, 50 years old, and they finally found sort of the words to describe with a community that can sort of embrace them and what happened to them. And so I really think that just like, there are other people who've experienced these things, unfortunately, but there are communities that are here to help and support and help find healing over time. And yeah, really just, you're not alone.
Thank you. All right, how can friends, family, communities, how can create a space, a safe space for survivors? Talk to us a little bit about that at different points during someone's journey too.
Yeah, it's a great question, and we get that a lot on our way with our questions. We get survivors who submit questions, but also questions from loved ones who want to support people. And one thing we know through research is the first person you tell your story to and how they react actually drastically impacts your healing journey. It's not impossible if you have a terrible reaction from someone, but it makes it challenging, right? So sometimes we don't always get to choose when folks disclose to us. It comes to folks in different ways and different spaces, but being able to listen without judgment, trying not to give advice or force someone to make a decision they're not ready for. I always encourage folks to just really listen, validate what they're experiencing, and say, how can I help? What might you need? And if you don't know, just know that that question's an ongoing question, and you can always come back to me if something comes to you, right? And then I think once someone does disclose, recognizing the healing journey is a process, and there's going to be some days that are better than others. And I think just that commitment to staying there and being here and being ready to receive your experience, your thoughts, your words when you're ready. I think we want to help and we want to control these things. We want to make someone not suffer. And often it's not in our control as a supporter of a survivor. It's really on them. So giving them the resources they need and just being there, I think really goes a long way.
And Amrita, how about you, from your perspective? How can friends, family, communities create a safe space for survivors?
I think it's twofold because I think a lot of points were answered because we often do judge when people don't leave. And I think a survivor needs her own time and some will never leave. And I think we need to learn to respect that. And I think we need to understand why women stay in abusive relationships and why women can't leave. And the reasons for staying is a lot longer than the reasons for leaving. And I think a lot of you who've done this work know that it's more tangible when you stay, and it's a lot more emotional, the kind of independence and freedom and safety that you get, you might not be able to see it. So I think people who are working with frontline and with survivors, I think we need to understand that model. But also I just want to bring in men and boys. And I think as a very strong feminist who's been working in this sector for close to 25 years, I never thought I would be talking about men and boys, but today I do, because if we have to talk with, or we need to address the other genders as well, because you can't be talking about ending violence against women if you're only working with women. So that is something SWAM started doing 10 years ago, is to engage with men and boys. And it's been a fascinating journey because men are not born violent and abusive. You know, there is this whole socialization process and there's a larger picture to it. And I think it also is somebody is abusive because we don't call them out. And I'm not talking about there are ranges of violence. I'm not talking about extreme gruesome violence, but the everyday belittling, mental violence, torture, it's because you can get away with it. You do it because you get away. So I think it's, when you talk about friends and family, it's not just supporting the survivors, but supporting that your brother, your father, your friend, or whoever to say back off. I think that's rude or that's disrespectful. I don't think we do enough of that. So I think the onus is on each one of us to break that cycle, not just with women, supporting women, but calling out men for their behavior. But again, not in a judgmental way, because I think we are all stuck in a very socialized, patriarchal, toxic world. And I think we need to understand why we behave what we do.
That's something really quick. Something that just came to me as you were speaking is like survivors are everywhere. And so something that I want to name is that the way you comment on news articles or other people's stories, like survivors are listening and people are able to tell if you're a safe person or not. So just being aware of like the way we're judging other people and reacting to things that we see online, that is another way to create a safe space because you never know who's in the room. And if they see you saying, that's really messed up what happened, and I'm really worried about that person, they might say, okay, that's a person I might be able to tell my story to.
I had that experience when I hosted the girlfriend. I did not expect so many people to reach out to me. I thought maybe a couple hundred people would hear the podcast, and today I still get really powerful messages for women who say, no, thank you for being a voice. And really encourage them to share with you. So love to open it up. Sounds like we have some time.
What to do,
Yeah.
Just to remind everyone, we are live streaming to YouTube, so if you would prefer to feed your questions through one of us, that'd be great. Otherwise, please, ready to hear your questions. I have a question for Caroline. What's your piece of advice?
I thought it was a moderator. You know, the girlfriends have been just a very interesting journey for me. And you were talking about those different stages, right? And I'm thinking I was in the minimizing and shutdown stage for a long time. And then the girlfriends received such amazing awareness. And so what I learned from it is that you have to own your story. Because when you own your story, it's your superpower. And from there, it's all uphill. You know, and so I just admire everyone here, you know, for helping and owning and creating safe spaces. It just never ceases to amaze me. And today, I just pay that forward. So thank you.
Thank you. Here, oh, sorry.
Hi. Hi, my name is Shaprana. I'm from also for a sexual assault or a sexual assault whisperer network called Callisto. I just wanted to ask, because a big issue that we face for survivors that come to our anonymous platform to be able to match with other survivors assaulted by the same perpetrator is that the biggest barrier that they face is essentially just feeling like they're going to become social outcasts on their campus once they even anonymously report if they match with another survivor. And, you know, they're afraid of like facing that social repercussion. So I was wondering, are there any other suggestions that you guys might have to kind of combat that in any way to make them feel less afraid of dealing with that?
Open it up to who wants to go first?
Man.
Point toss.
I have thoughts.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, the first thing, this is a hard thing to say. I do a lot of work in the campus space, and I think that's a very real fear. I just think that that is real. And until we start making campus level change, I think it's valid here. So one of the ways I know that at our wing, we try to combat that is for many survivors, maybe you will lose friends, you might lose people, but maybe those aren't your people, right? And that's hard to say, especially in college when social desirability and it really matters to fit in. But that's why I think we're trying to create online spaces with like-minded people and other survivors, because at least in my work, I've seen it's often been that shift of, really mourning and feeling the loss of these friends that you thought were real friends, but then encouraging it that there are other people on campus. 1 in 4 women, right? 1 in 2 trans people, 1 in 6 men, they're out there. And so finding those people, whether they have violence experience themselves or just like a strong, supporter of that is important. So I think it's more there's more to that, and campus can be quite big, but I do want to acknowledge that I feel that that's.
Can I butt in? I agree, but it's also very complicated. We also know of campuses. I don't know about US. I can talk about 2, one in Kolkata where I work, and one in Paris. I was supporting somebody facing sexual violence in a very well-known university in Paris. And when I looked online, it was a pattern that was happening there. And I think these are common things. So I think it's important to support the survivor to speak up and try to get her a community. But I think it's also long-term work that we need to do with those institutions, because it might not be safe then to speak up and finding support outside that space, because there are toxic spaces, there are people in positions of power who are misusing power, and then you have a backlash, and we are not even talking about backlash that's happening against feminists globally, and it's happening in these campuses where you speak up. So yes, you might, and a lot of young people are vulnerable and they go with the herd. And even if they know that's wrong, they don't have that ability to speak up and stand up for themselves. So getting support is very important. But speaking up and speaking out, I think it's a fine balance, and you have to figure out where and when, and it could be you come back at a later point. It's complicated, but I think as organizations and institutions, we have to do a lot more work at our school, college, corporate levels, because it is a toxic space.
That's clear. I know more. My name is Melissa, and I would agree with exactly what you're saying. In the UK, we have something called the National Union of Students, and they all are supposed to adopt how they react. Now, when I was here 10 years ago, there was a confederation of universities and colleges in the US that were doing this work. I don't know if they still are. And it's tied to Title IX. And to have those kind of safe spaces is critical for people to feel free. To your point, they may not be your people, but there has to be someplace safe campus.
And I would just go back to what you just said real quick, which is, if you're speaking to a survivor who's worried about speaking out, especially in a platform like yours, where it's matching with somebody else who's been through it, you're getting somebody else who's your support right there.
Yeah.
That person, that survivor that you are now connected to, is your new person. They are your new system to start finding your balance. That is more powerful and more helpful to you than anybody else you're gonna lose. And that is speaking from personal experience.
That is validating. Thank you.
A couple of the really quick thoughts on college survivors specifically. There's a lot of amazing organizations that work in space, including, Callisto. It's on Us does a lot of sort of campus organizing work. Also on the preventative side, Kenyor at Enrique on Campus, they created a campus accountability tool, which is actually tracking the known incidence rate on colleges, at least across the United States. I think they've got most of them. So there are a lot of other people that are doing this amazing work, but then we're also seeing these small communities of folks being there to support survivors. Like, we work really closely, well, I think all of our organizations work really closely with Ray at Temple University, who's really an amazing advocate. And so we see these sort of grassroots movements where survivors may come out, share their story and report, and then they're getting connected into one of these organizations or one of these leaders that's then helping to find the support and resources that they may have not had before. And that's really exciting to us to see sort of all of that come together.
I have a question. Specifically actually for Caroline too, but a chance to sort of explain this piece is that we've spoken a lot about how you find the resources and tools when you are enduring either domestic or sexual violence, and how important it is them to meet you where you're at. And I know when we work so closely on the Survivors Guide, you've spoke very much so about where your safe spaces were to gather information. And we were always so aware of actually the importance of having multiple tools and avenues to receive that. Could you talk to us a little bit about your Kindle and why that became your space where you can access?
Well, my abuser, great question. My abuser used to go through my phone all the time. I had obviously nothing to hide, but he always thought I had something to hide because possibly he had something to hide. But he would never go on my Kindle for some reason. And I thought maybe that's the safe space. And I didn't feel safe back then. I still don't feel safe because he's not in jail. But I decided I was going to do all the healing, all the psychospiritual work I could do, focusing on myself and, my mental health, my spiritual health, and just move on, in fear, without fear. I know this is a lifelong journey, and I know I will be fine, whether he is held accountable or not. Because this doesn't define me. And I think we're launching the Kindle today, so I'm very proud.
It's like, thank you. So it's available on all ebook platforms and Kindle. And you have to find it by the author and the title.
I think I saw a hand up over there before, so but yeah, we've got it too.
How do you recommend reaching out to somebody that you think may be in an abusive relationship?
That is always the trickiest question to answer. There is no right or wrong. One thing I saw recently, I'm not sure who posted it, but it was a social media post. My favorite thing was, don't tell them what they should do. They're already being told that every day, all day. Tell them that you're there and that you're the one place. And that, if you want, here's a resource, but you don't have to be that resource for them. You don't have to give them that resource because that might be too much for them. They might not be able to physically have a piece of paper that says. In fact, one of my local organizations actually had little wooden discs that had a hotline number on it instead of having cards. So that way it could just kind of be slipped into the change purse. And it wasn't something that was as easily noticeable. And you could just kind of slip it in somebody's bag as you walk by. So there's no right or wrong way. The best is to be there and to listen and to support them where they're at and let them share what they're feeling.
I might add one so we've worked with some male survivor groups that work directly with male survivors. And what's actually been fascinating to us is just learning these differences between these different populations, whether it's childhood survivors or male survivors or some combination thereof. And for the male survivors specifically, one of the things that I remember really stuck with me is they said, a lot of those folks, they don't come out and explicitly say what's happened to them in the last, whether it's recent or whether it's in the distant past. But a lot of times they'll talk about boundaries or the way that those conversations are navigated with those folks is discussions on things that sort of like are borderline to the topic issue area. And they may never actually want to talk about it, but I think that trying to facilitate that listening environment, being there, and then knowing the sort of audience that you're working with and what their preferences are in communication, and everyone's different, obviously. But I think that that's another way that we've seen sort of interesting, like almost like side conversations about things, and then that's been sort of a conduit to then getting people resources and access.
Amrita, I want to throw this one to you.
Can I just answer to this to interrupt you? There's one more thing. I think we have to be realistic of where the woman is coming from, because violence is across caste, class, religion, sexuality. And I think what resources is available. I mean, in most of the not Western world, there isn't social security. So your reason to leave is dependent on who do you have for support, what social security you have for support, or family. And unfortunately, in the 21st century, we're still talking about shame and stigma, which is absolutely ridiculous, but it's very much a real thing. So I think what Hannah said, that I think just give them the information and wait for them to reach out. And a lot of people don't even realize that what they're going through is violence and abuse, and it's their coping mechanism. And we just have to work with that. Sorry, Hannah.
Yes, because I know your work, I know you've worked a lot of time in the UK and now for many, many years in India. I almost want to get your point of view on how do we look at healing in both sides of the equation, right? Do we find our maybe model currently in places like the US, UK, Australia, very clinically focused? Or do you think that those models are just adopting like that in other parts of the world, like India? So or are they kind of finding other ways that we are not exploring, because we just find that there is so much things that are being done and trialed that maybe we are not adopting here at that kind of place.
So very tough question. It feels like an exam. I think there are a couple of things. One is in the West, it's a little more structured. I mean, here I'm hearing about a lot more interesting, innovative online platforms, which I didn't know 5, 7, 10 years ago. So that's interesting. So there is things to learn, and things in India, because India is one of the biggest internet kind of users. But I was asking, I'm not sure whether I was asking Kyle or somebody else, how do you keep the conversation safe online? Somebody I was asking yesterday. It's because I want to take that away. So, there are good practices at both ends, but also I think both in US and UK, I have experience from UK, there are shelter homes and there are community spaces, whether we do a lot more group work, because recovery does happen in groups. Mm-hmm. We see counseling and recovery and mental health as a very structured one-to-one intervention. Mm-hmm. And even if it is in a group, it's in a very formal, structured way. Often it can be informal. It could be, we have something called Adda, which means just a gathering of chatting. So you put on a film, you see the film, you discuss it, and you have an informal discussion and you support each other and you learn from each other. Learning and support doesn't always have to be structured and driven formally by a counselor or therapist. So I think it's about kind of finding innovative ways of where there is limited resources. Mm-hmm. And also in both these spaces, there is ethnic population. And I think language also is a challenge. So I think we have to also be creative, because one model will not fit everybody. So I think we have things to take away. I have things to take away. And I think there are things that you can try and do differently.
I think one thing, so Brendan and I came from the technology space, right? And I think that, we've learned so much about this space, but there's a lot of issues with technology, right? Like technology companies and data and all these different areas. But I think that the one lesson that we've really tried to bring into this, that I think is applicable to all of our organizations, is really how do we reduce the cognitive load on survivors, right? So many of the traditional resources, we're giving people pages of 50 resources, and maybe there's information that we already know about them, and so we have to find these creative ways to reduce the number of steps to get people closer with the resources that they're looking for. Now, it doesn't mean that one size intervention fits all, but the more that we can customize these things, the more that if we're giving somebody a resource list and we know their IP address where they're coming from, and maybe it's from India or maybe it's from somewhere else, why can't we pare down that list to only those resources in that country? Why can't we read the semantic request of their message and use AI to say, oh, well, they said, these various themes of, maybe domestic violence or these other things, and then give them just those things. And I think it's a very simple representation of like what's possible. But really, like if we can just all work, that's the hard part, is how do we just reduce that cognitive load to get people the best and most customized favorite resources?
A question, but it's actually bouncing back to what you just said earlier about the power of the collectiveness of healing. And anyone who's ever had the blessing of being in a shelter knows that the most powerful space in that house is the kitchen. It's incredibly complicated. But in some ways, it's to you, Hannah, the fact that your group specifically enables other survivors and those during abuse to directly provide that support to other people.
Yeah.
What are you sort of feeling in that space about how people respond to like that, instead of it being the advocate, professional?
So just a little background. We were started by a survivor who shared her story and it went viral. And the amount of people that commented with their stories on her story is what caused us to start the support group in the first place. And the empowering feeling of, from both sides, being the person to post and have 10, 50, 100 people comment back, either affirming what you're going through or giving you some nugget of advice or just being there with you is so amazingly empowering because you are no longer alone. That said, being able to comment on people's posts is one of the most empowering things. As a survivor myself, now I have been on the support group for 3 years now. And during that time, I don't comment all the time. I have reached a different level of integration in my healing. But that does not mean that when I get on there and I do post, it is still so empowering to know that I am helping somebody else who's in this situation. And I think that peer-to-peer allows people to be freer with their words, with their actions, with how they interact with each other, and gives it even more of a safer space because there's nobody telling you, oh, well, the training says, or this study said. It's none of that. It's just two people saying, oh, well, I experienced something like that. Or, well, this is what I did to help my shut up, sir. This is something that I did to help me through this situation. And it's just, from my side of it, it's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen.
It's a question.
Thank you for very enriching panel. I'm just wondering, in this whole spectrum of the discussion that of the survivors, how to support them, and where do you think the role of the livelihood generations, in particular in those countries where as Amrita also said, there's no social security or the financial support for the survivors, and many times we see, particularly for the cases of domestic violence, that they have children, they're single mother. So how the livelihood generation activities can be integrated with the support service to the survivors. And also often we see that even for the livelihood generation activity for survivors, when we plan, that is more from the healing perspective, which is completely understandable and which is required. But many times those are not marketable. So that skilling is not marketable, and there's no investment in the skilling for the survivors. So how this whole issue of the financial access to financial resources, skilling, and the financial independence is located in this support to survivors? Just a question to any of the candidates.
Thoughts? That is not our area. So I don't know. we actually do care packages. So for those who are survivors, if they reach out and ask, say, we're having financial difficulties, we can't get these things, we can't get those things, we send out care packages to our survivors, which include all sorts of things that could be helpful to them, including gift cards to grocery stores. And we also send them to legal, give them legal resources, as well as there's some banks that we've worked with that have been really beneficial in helping loans for survivors. And so we give out that information as well.
I could answer a little bit of that if you like. I think what I could say possibly is that we are starting to really open up and embrace the impact of financial abuse. And we are now across the world and in sort of really different pockets through Surviving Economic Abuse Coalition, for example, are really digging into those financial institutions and looking at the way in which they position their products and how those products can indirectly facilitate abuse, and how important that is to get those things right. So there's a lot of work for us to do in that space overall. But actually, I think that, when we spoke initially about what are those barriers for leaving and engaging with support, we often think that actually the point of actualizing and being freed from abuse is greater than the moment of, well, how am I going to feed my children? How am I going to sustain a livelihood? And having and appreciating that tension is incredibly important when you're working with survivors. But I think the other thing that we always sort of in a way not recognize is that not all survivors coming to and experiencing abuse are in a situation where they do not have the resources financially. And that there are many people who potentially are working in really high-powered jobs who you would assume have the financial resources to leave, but they are being indirectly controlled, or they are potentially, because of the way that they're working, not thought of in this realm of the average service delivery. And I know that was something we spoke quite a lot about with Caroline, about how do we reach that group of people who are potentially not able or do not feel that they can access helplines or hotlines, or even the point of going into a shelter and the sort of unpicking of all the financial abuse and the entangled web and how you look at that. But I don't know, Caroline, if you want to.
Yes, well, I was a victim of financial abuse. My abuser stole my checks and forged my signature on my checks. He had no signing authority for a total of $100,000. That's grand larceny. He has not been held accountable. His bank just allowed his very crappy forgery to go through. I couldn't even believe it, and I have evidence of that. That's why I'm openly speaking about it. And also, to your point, when you are in a certain position, when you're a CEO, or when you are a pillar of a community, you're so afraid of speaking out because of the backlash, the judgment. You're afraid to, lose your career or lose your business. So when I decided to go public, I had to have a meeting with my 3 male board members. And I sat down and I said, guys, this is what happened to me. Is it going to be a problem for our company? And they all were so supportive and so encouraging. And they all, messaged me privately. And to this day, they're like on my social media, liking and making comments. And so it's been great. But I recognize not everybody has, this privilege, and it's sad.
I will just add to that real quick. I also had a lot of financial abuse in mine, and when I was going through mine, that was something that people didn't even understand. So I ended up having to file bankruptcy at the age of 20 for $250,000. So it ruined my credit for about 20 years. I'm able to get a car now, which is really exciting. Because no credit card company, no bank, nobody would loan me any money because I had this on my record because he did this to me. Wow. So it comes in all shapes and sizes, but it's a lot more common than was ever previously discussed. And it wasn't until about 10 years ago that I started hearing it as part of the language that we were discussing in terms of abuse and all the forms it takes. And I think that it's very important that we start recognizing that no matter where you started in your situation, where you're ending, it may not look the same.
Can I add to your point also that I think there's a huge spectrum. So there is what Golden and her organization works on is looking at a kind of survivors trying to break away and looking at economic empowerment opportunities. But then there's the other spectrum we spoke about is people, women in successful spaces and financially independent. So linking education and financial independence as one of the ways that violence doesn't happen is not true at all. So breaking that cycle around that is very important, because even in refuges, we've seen women from such affluent backgrounds, they would never ever last in a refuge. I have this fabulous story I talk about in London where she called up and she was meant to come into the refuge because the police had referred her. She said, "Can I get my piano?" Grand piano. I'm like, no, you have one room and a common space. You can't get the piano. But she didn't last more than a day because she was used to a totally different lifestyle and it can't be managed there. The other kind of financial abuse we don't talk about is you get everything. We had a woman who left her marriage after 30 years and her husband, Iranian background in UK, and she used to wear only, Dior and fancy clothes. And she said she had never bought an outfit in her whole life. Her husband bought everything for her. So we took her to Primark and she bought a £5 dress. And she's like, I don't know how to buy it because I've never bought anything for myself. So, financial control has many, many different sides to it. I'm a co-signer in his company, which means I'm also liable. Anything goes wrong, I go down with it. So I think we really need to see the broader spectrum of financial violence and financial control. We only see one bottom, but there's a whole range around it.
Can I just make a quick word? I really, really, really have to thank Caroline. Publicly, not only for the support and the work done, but when we had that very first call, you really made this sense of awareness on the people who were in the call and read it to the whole team of the way that we were creating resources, which is the way that I feel the majority of the sector creates resources, which was leaving out a big group of women who might not go through those routes. And I really thank you for that because it caused a whole shift on like how can we cater to a group who actually might not go through all of this routes. And you can see that really well reflected, conversations in the lighthouse. And so I'm so grateful, and I always want to put that in everybody's mind because we have to help everyone. And domestic abuse is not only around financial need. It's so much more. So thank you for that.
You're very well. There's a question at that.
I was just wondering if Laura could expand a bit on the cultural nuances that she found in the research, how you think that should inform the kind of support that we offer survivors.
Sure, thanks for asking. So I'm part of a global initiative called My Story. And so we're researchers from now 12 different countries conducting research in our own communities with all different types of survivors trying to understand healing and help seeking. And so we always were talking about what might be shared as like a human experience and where does culture come in, both in how violence is perpetrated, but also in the healing journey. And so what we've sort of found is this core sort of humanness and healing about maybe some of these goals folks might have, like connecting with other people or managing their symptoms or, thinking about their own identity and who they are. But how folks go about doing that is very cultural. And so I think we think about like seeking help as like service use, but there's also all of these actions people are doing every day, going for that walk, forest bathing, all these different things. So there's all these different nuances that I could talk about. One that really stands out to me, I was with my Japanese colleague Sachiko the other day, and we were talking about this. We were looking at the body maps. And in Japan, she had found a lot of her survivors that she had been working with a lot of their trauma manifested in their body. So it was more socially acceptable to talk about physical symptoms, headaches, stomach aches, and that was an avenue to seeking help. And like starting there was more useful. Where in America, our body maps, we're almost like talking heads. We have all these thoughts and anxiety and all these different things, right? Feelings, so much feelings. And so in America, we're always like, how are you feeling? Like, oh, I'm sad, I'm this. And in Japan, how are you feeling? Well, my stomach hurts, I'm feeling tired. So even just that shift of how we think about things is really interesting. Another thing that we notice a lot, like nuances from culture, is how stigma and shame manifest. So people feeling shame because they stay in America, a lot of generalizing, but I feel shame for staying. Why did you stay? How could you possibly stay in that? Or the shame of, how could you possibly leave in other cultures, right? Like, how could you break this marital bonds? That's terrible. So all those different nuances, I think, just help explain that culture is so important. And especially in research, we have a terrible problematic history of being extremely westernized. And so, it's the story of you take the well and you drop it somewhere and you're just like, all right, good luck using it. And we don't think about who's going to maintain it. Do you even want the well, right? So one of the ways we're going to kind of break those cycles is to work with researchers in their own communities and actually compare and name the culture. And of course, culture's not a monolith, and there's all cultures within cultures. So again, nothing's perfect, but the more we can start to tease these things out, the better we can personalize care.
We have time, 2 more questions right here, and then we're gonna wrap up. Yeah.
Okay, kind of sitting here listening, and knowing how long some of you've been working in this space. What one policy, I know there's a lot of policy changes that we can ask for, but what needle moving policy or issue have you been working on that we should all be thinking about and trying to help get legislation or policy change for? Knowing that there's a lot, but I'm gonna try to see if there's 1 or 2 that we can walk out of here with and say, I can call my congressperson and say, do this or think about this.
One that comes to mind, only because it's top of mind for me. And again, this is maybe very America specific. And I'm not sure how folks feel in this room, so but we have a very tricky, very carceral way of approaching gender-based violence in America. And a lot of what I hear in my work is that survivors are looking for options to hold people accountable, but maybe they don't want to put this person in jail. Some folks do, of course, want this. So a lot of the work that I do is looking at like restorative justice as a potential vehicle, as an option for survivors if they're interested, to be able to, and I won't get into all the nuances of this, but you don't actually even need to have the person who harmed you in a restorative process is going on. There's ways to give impact statements to a surrogate person to just like let that out. And there's just so much power and creativity in that space. And so I'm actually working on a project right now with first, it's encouraging, and we haven't gotten this grant taken away yet. It's Congress's first investment in actually evaluating restorative programs across the country that have been grassroots, and we just never really have used the evidence to be able to advocate for Congress to put more money into this. We just see, are they working? Are survivors liking them? How can we improve them? How can we standardize training so that survivors are getting good care and facilitators that can really reduce the risk of re-traumatization and harm? So one thing I'm really passionate about is thinking about how can we give survivors more options for accountability.
I will add that for me, it's twofold. One is we need more standardized laws around what abuse looks like. Abuse is so even culturally different from, I live in Vermont, from Vermont to New York. Half my charges are in New York, half my charges were in Vermont, and it was night and day. The other thing is getting health insurance to cover mental health for survivors, to cover physical health for survivors. We are not deemed as needing these things, and PTSD is still not something that's discussed as a long-term problem for survivors. I've had PTSD for 23 years. Does that mean that, what my day looks like every day is the same as somebody who doesn't have PTSD? No, but I'm not a soldier, so it doesn't look the same for me. And so I am not treated with the same abilities to get help and accessibility that others. So for me, that is where
This resonates so much. Again, I'm not talking from the US perspective, more from India and global perspective. I think funding generally is a concern everywhere, and we need to kind of flag that up. There's funding for so many other things, but women's services is crucial, especially if you're talking about 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 women. It's most of us, so there is no reason why we can't put money into services. Secondly, training around frontline professionals. And I think this is globally, I don't know about US, so I will not make a comment, but generally in most parts of the world, when you have professionals who are delivering, whether it's police or legal aid lawyers, they don't have enough support and training on to be sensitive and understand forms of violence and provide the right level of support. So I think appropriate service training for the individuals who are working with survivors is crucial. Thirdly, in India and some parts of the world, there are laws in place. It's about the implementation of the law. It's about the training, the money. So you've created a fabulous law, but you've not allocated resources to implement the law. You've not trained the departments that are meant to implement the law. So I think globally, whichever country, I think it's about looking at what we already have instead of constantly recreating new things and then finding ways to implement them more safely. And lastly, I think backlash is something we need to talk about. The same way we need to talk about funding, we need to talk about backlash because it's global. So whether it's professionals who are working in the sector that's facing it online or a survivor facing it, and a lot of the laws are being rolled back. So women-centric laws are being neutralized. So I think somewhere we need to acknowledge, and we are not still in the position that we have to make everything gender neutral. Yes, we need to acknowledge that men do face violence and abuse, but our research shows women face a larger proportion of that. So I think acknowledging but not neutralizing is where we need to still be at, but we are really sugarcoating things and not talking about the real story.
Oh, I was just gonna say one thing. I feel like we're not doing as much policy work, but sort of a slightly different lens, which is very controversial, very difficult, but it has to be addressed if we're going to stop this work, is there need to be more conversations, I think, directly with perpetrators, honestly. I think it's been proven that there are these cycles of violence that go down generations, these patterns and learned behaviors that, cause for these issues to happen in the first place. And I think that there's no way to do this work and to, increase prevention efforts and improve upon prevention efforts unless we get a better understanding of these cycles of violence. And we're seeing some really interesting patterns around like survivors that are coming to us and sharing a story from when they were childhood, and then they were also expressing that they were a perpetrator, and we're just like trying to get our heads wrapped around all of that. Like, how do we deal with that, right? How do we have conversations about all these different dynamics and these, intersectional, things? And so, but I do think that, historically we haven't wanted to embrace the perpetrator in a way because they're the one who caused the harm in the first place. But I think that there's no way to do this work and prevent this unless we can find more of those conversations.
Thank you. I would just love to add to that. I think it's a problem of the space that we work in. We have almost decided to leave perpetrator works in one side in favor of work for victims for obvious reasons. And I think shifting that into mainstreaming work with people who have abused. Not only there's a lot of learning to be done still, but just putting a lot of that into practice and really making sure that those services are out there, they're everywhere, they're running. There are states in this country that do not have a perpetrator, program. And we know that, people who abuse also come in a range, in a scale, right? So at least work with a group that can't be influenced. So I think there's a general, we all have to open more our minds that is part of the work that we need to all be involved to actually get somewhere. So I just want to point that out.
slightly different is I have a concern with the word perpetrator because we are addressing it at a much later stage. I've seen the perpetrator program say, okay, right now because Swayam is working with men and boys, I can see that we have to start the work at a young age and we have to work with men and boys to change mindsets because it's so, I mean, I was having a lot of conversation with Hannah and other people that it's a socialization process. Men are not born violent. It's a socialization process that makes you violent. So I think it's our media, it's our films, it's our textbooks, it's our school, it's everything. So I think that adult 45-year-old perpetrator is way too late in the game. Also that there is, and I'm talking from India and the UK perspective, we have to be a little mindful on are we taking a box by doing a perpetrator program, and there's a lot of money flowing into men and boys work. So I think it might shift the balance with the women's work. So I think we have to be conscious of it. Also, it's a tick box exercise. I know of enough organizations which are doing 6 sessions or 5 sessions. You can't change mindsets in 5 1-hour classes. So I think it's a long process of going back and forth. That person might reflect that, yes, what I did to my girlfriend was not right. And then again, 6 months later, he might give her a whack, which is wrong. But I think it's going to take a long time. And I think, does it mean he's fallen off the radar as a champion? Maybe not. And I think those are our own reflections that we have to do. But working with young kids, men and children generally, about discrimination and violence and gender equality at a school age is the way forward.
I mean, I cannot agree. I mean, with no more focus on prevention for gender-based violence, that's what we want to see, right? A real big focus on prevention and not getting to people who, abuse stage. But yes, it's also I do see your point very clearly about what is the balance, who defines what is the balance, and where. Because there could be places where a lot of that money is being invested equally, and there might be a place where there's just nothing of it being done. So it's also like a case by case scenario. I love what you were talking about, like New York and Vermont. Having done frontline services in New York, I know how there's everything, and there's toughness here, and that might just not exist at all in other places. So that's basically fine.
All right, so I'm not going to be allowed to be a moderator ever again if I don't close it down. But we're at time. So I want to thank our panelists, Laura, Caroline, Kyle, Hannah, and Rita. Unbelievable. Round of applause. All of you are creating space to recognize the power of storytelling, and not just as a means of sharing experience, but as a tool of impact. And thank you to Know More and Speak Your Truth Today and Our Way for sponsoring this. And Survivors' Voices Drive Action, shape services, and build stronger, more informed communities. So let's keep up the work and the support. Thank you, everyone.